It's wonderful to be here with you tonight. You and Don have been so much a part of my life. I met Don Ridings the day I went to work at the Courier-Journal, now more than 45 years ago. And throughout his life, he was a major influence in mine, as you became as well. And so tonight we get to talk about some of those grand times. And I'd like to start by asking you about your youth. You describe yourself as a cradle Presbyterian.
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us about your roots in the denomination, and particularly about the special role that your mother played in the church?
Yes, a cradle Presbyterian. The Presbyterianism actually came from my father. My mother, he married a Methodist who became a Presbyterian. And they had 4 children. They both taught Sunday school. Both were elders in the church, pillars of the church we called them then. And the pew at First Presbyterian Church in Charleston, West Virginia, the second pew in on the left was the saddest pew. You know how, it's still that way. Don't we all sit the same place? But my mother in particular, that was a time when women did a lot in the church, but they weren't seen as the leaders of the church except by those who knew what they really did. And my mother actually was the second woman to become an elder in the entire PCUS denomination, right after Rachel Hinderlight in Richmond, Virginia. And that, I have to add, that didn't sit all that well with some of my relatives. They thought women, yeah, you know how that goes. Maybe you don't, those of you who are so young. But she, in fact, this was not part of a church thing, she also was the first woman juror in the entire state of West Virginia. And I'll tell you how that came about, because it's part of that story. She was the president of the women of the church. She'd been, whatever the title is, the head of the Presbyterian Women's Organization, so forth. So she was pretty well known as a church lady. Well, they said they drew names because they knew there was going to be a lot of press attention to the first woman ever to sit on a jury in the state of West Virginia. And then I looked, and it was her. I found out when I went to work at the Charleston Daily Mail after school, where I worked in the afternoons, and they showed me the front page of my mother, my father, and the dog. And she's holding her hand up to her face like that. But I looked at the veneer, I looked at the entire group of people who'd been eligible to become that first woman juror. Presbyterian, the woman who headed the Episcopalian women, the woman who held the office of the Methodist Women's United, whatever it is. They were all heads of the women's church organization, various denominations. So they were playing it safe.
They sure were.
Of course, that's sometimes people say that's what happens in West Virginia. You know, they kind of did that.
It wasn't exactly drawing straws, was it?
No, it was not. But she did have a tremendous effect on all our lives. She was a oldest of 6 children in a coal mining town, Boomer, West Virginia. Boomer, that tells you. Coal mining. And all of her family, she insisted that all of us, and her own, including her 4 children, got a good education. That's where the education really set in. That was your ticket to a meaningful life, was good education.
And of course the Presbyterian Church has also been grounded in the notion of good education, has it not?
Absolutely. In fact, my interest in the seminary and other related things like that is because I do believe so firmly in the absolute necessity of an educated, well-educated clergy, and I'll expand that to well-educated church leadership, not just clergy, but yes. The answer is yes, I do.
Yes. Your early goal was to become a journalist.
Yes.
And growing up in West Virginia, you saw lots of news developing, like the emerging women's and civil rights movements. Did they have an impact on your career, both as an activist and a public servant?
Yes, and that was a really very early time for both of those significant developments.
Tell us a little bit about all of that.
I went to segregated schools until my senior year in college, senior year in high school. And that was when West Virginia or at least Charleston, I don't know how they did it, but our county totally desegregated 1 year. Everything at the same time. It happened to be my senior year in high school. And that was a learning experience. I can't say that I hold my memories very proudly of that year, because I did not go out of my way to make that a significant event for myself or for those in the school as well. But I also saw the civil rights movement moving in too. Again, it was West Virginia, a predominantly white state.
Still is.
It still is, but an extremely high level of Protestantism. I mean, we weren't all that, because West Virginians were pretty much sort of the same.
Wasn't it, West Virginia was so heavily Protestant that when Kennedy won the primary there, it really made the difference in his ability to become nominated and become president.
You're absolutely right. That was a significant event in the Kennedy campaign to me when that occurred. And I had good friends who were working on that campaign in West Virginia. It was my first year as a voter too, so that was made it doubly significant for me. But West Virginia had the highest proportion of Protestants of any state in the nation. I don't know if that's still true or not. But if he could make his mark in West Virginia, then he could, because the Catholicism was a major issue. And so it doesn't have to sound weird now. I mean, it does to me.
Thank goodness.
I'm glad it does sound weird, yes.
Well, the women's movement really emerged in your 20s and when you were just in college and getting out of college. Tell us a little bit about how that affected you.
Well, I didn't do myself real proud, I don't think. I graduated from journalism school and accepted a job as a cub reporter in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I went down to do my interviews, and the head of the Human Resources Department told me they would be glad to have me, and here would be what we call now the package. I was mostly interested in what the weekly package would be.
Sure.
And he told me what it was. I'm pretty sure I remember. It was $90 a week. And he told me that, of course, it would be much more if I were a man. Oh, now this is the truth. I remember him well. He later was publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer, so I got to see him a lot, and we talked about that. But he told me that, and I have to tell you, I'm not real proud of that sounded normal to me. And he was saying that if you were a man, because you'd have a family that you needed to care for. And I said, yes. I frankly was pleased with $90 a week. So anyway.
Well, we had a city editor at the Courier Journal who once said he'd trade 4 girl reporters for 1 good wastebasket. So that was the same era.
My husband never told me that one. That could have set me up.
He knew the man. Starting in those early years in Charlotte, you had some very exciting times, and one of the things I discovered was that you were somewhere very interesting on November 22nd, 1963. Where was that?
That's correct. I was in the second year as a reporter at the Charlotte Observer, and I had gone there, well, because they offered me $90 a week, but I was wanted to cover the textile market. Now, this may sound really strange to those of you who are not of my age, but at that time, the textile industry was a big deal. Mm-hmm. The union movement was really exciting, and North Carolina and South Carolina were very much in the thick of that. And the Charlotte Observer, being right on the border of the 2 states, covered it a lot. So I got to, that was my main beat. That also means I was fashion editor because I was a woman. But I didn't get to cover the textile industry, and I started that day that Keith just mentioned in Los Angeles, California, because I was out there to cover the textile market, the Men's Apparel Guild in California, their annual meeting where they were going to be doing textile stuff. So I started out in Los Angeles, and I was to change planes going back to Charlotte in Dallas, Texas, Love Field. We landed at Love Field, and that's when I learned that I wasn't going to be leaving Love Field like I thought. They had closed down the airport entirely. That was the day of the Kennedy assassination, and I was at Love Field. Air Force One was out there because they had brought people in on that. And I went in, I have to say my first thought was, I mean, that's a terrible thing, but I'm a reporter. I'm in Dallas, Texas.
Sure.
We could not move out of Love Field. We couldn't go out the door. We could not do anything. I called the Observer, told them, I'm in Dallas. I'm at Love Field, but I can't, they won't let me get out and do anything. So they said, do what you can, do what you can. You know, they were going to have a Dateline, Dallas, for one of their reporters. So I went around and I interviewed people in the airport.
Did you get a story?
Of course I had a story. It was A1. I mean, they had a reporter in Dallas.
There you go.
That was a big scoop.
Of course.
And we couldn't leave there until all the, Sarah Hughes, the judge, came out. They did the swearing in ceremony for Lyndon Johnson on board that plane. And when that had left, when the plane left, then we could leave. Yeah. So it was
quite a day. After you and your husband, Don, moved to Louisville in the late 60s, you became involved in the League of Women Voters. And that organization has been important to you throughout your life. I sat with Katie Christopherson here tonight, who was part of that era with you. What was it that you learned as a young wife and mother and professional about the League and the leadership skills that it gave you?
Well, the first was a very selfish one. We had just moved to Louisville in 1968. I had, as a reporter, worked myself into a legislative reporting position in North Carolina, and that's where I first ran into the League. I found out that if I was covering a governmental issue and I wanted the facts, these facts and these facts, that I went to the League of Women Voters. They knew what they were talking about. And they also didn't tilt the scales. They told you this, they told you this. Now, if you asked them, they'd tell you what they thought. But first, the facts was this, the fact on the other side says this, and here they are. So I really knew this was a group I could trust as a source. Now, I couldn't join the League because I was a reporter, and you don't get involved with organizations that you cover. So we moved to Louisville. I had a baby within 2 months. And I didn't know the community. I really didn't know it, so I just called the League office, local League, and said, I don't need to come to a coffee or a tea or anything. Just send me the news notice and tell me when the first meeting is. So they said, terrific, that's wonderful. So the first newsletter came, and it said, our newsletter editor has just moved to Kansas. Is there anybody you can, So I called up and said, I can do that. And they said, good, you're on the board. And that's how that all started. Yeah.
Somehow I can picture that. Well, in those days in Louisville, did the League have a very visible role, and did you meet the kinds of people who helped you sort of go in the next phase of your career?
Absolutely. Again, the trust I saw in the League, I heard from others as well. At that time, we were all women. Haven't been for a long time, but at the time it was all women's organizations. And I did realize, I learned quickly that both the elected officials and other community leaders had deep respect for this organization. And, that made me very proud. Of course, that was also the beginnings of the major issues here on school desegregation. You all, the people from Louisville anyway, who are in this room, know what happened then. I was local League president at the time of the busing situation, the attempts to change the Constitution and outlaw the use of busing for all that sort of stuff. We still had 2 separate school systems, and I mean, it was something that was really rocking this community. The League was very deep into that because, again, not just because it was an all-women's organization, but we were very interested in education. The education issues were very, very front and center with the League and its studies. And we served on the task force for peaceful desegregation. I mean, you remember all those things that were going on at that time. The most memorable part of that, though, was when the Senate Judiciary Committee called a hearing on a constitutional amendment to outlaw the use of busing for school desegregation. So my board, of course, all said, well, we're going to go, of course. I thought, well, again, I didn't cover myself with honor. I didn't say, of course we will. I said, gosh, I don't know if they'll listen to us, and we probably can't afford it either. And they said, yes, we are going. So I said, okay. So I called up and frankly just told them we were going to be there. By then, my board had convinced me. See, a good board really is a good thing to have. And they first said, nah, yeah. But then, okay, all right, you can be after the elected officials. And then, of course, we didn't have the money either. Bless Edie Bingham. You all can pass on to her. She called and said, you know, we took up a little collection, and Edie said, I'll pay whatever you don't collect, I'll pay for it. So we went. It was broadcast back here in Louisville. All the elected officials who had not very good things to say about school desegregation went first. Then my turn came, and as somebody said, that was the first warm thing anybody said about the need for a desegregated system at all. But it was, as I say, broadcast back here, and it was sponsored by Kentucky Fried Chicken. I have a tape of that testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they're singing, finger licking good. And they come to the end of the commercial, and you hear Senator Eastland saying, and Dorothy ridings with the League of Women Voters. It was classic. So I gave my testimony, got back on the plane, come back home, and found out that our family had been threatened. Our neighborhood up here on Top Hill Road turned out to protect our home and our children. The phone lines where do you know where your children are, that kind of thing. I mean, it was not pleasant.
It was not a happy time.
No, it was not a happy time. It was not.
We've come a long way since then, and I think we can all agree that that effort has transformed our school system.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. Some very good people. We've made mistakes along the way, and well, I won't go on to my soapbox.
That's
but
all right.
Indeed, this place, because I was gone from here for 20 years.
That's
when
right.
I came back, that was to see what had happened, and it made me very happy. We still have, you never can have a school system that everybody's going to be very happy with everything they do. That's never going to be the case. Never, never, never. But we learned a lot.
Well, you cut your teeth with some pretty important issues, but in time you rose in the organization. And before we knew it, you were president of the National League of Women Voters. And it was at the time when Walter Mondale was running against President Reagan, as Bob mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I loved the story about your experience when you went to meet with James Baker, who was President Reagan's campaign contact for the debates.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell us how you risked national security on that occasion?
I was going to say, I don't think this story's ever been in print or anything.
Good.
But,
well, we'll hear it here for the first time tonight.
Well, Jim Baker was chief of staff under Ronald Reagan in his first administration, and Jim Johnson was the Mondale contact. So those were the two people that I worked with to pull off those debates. And I admit I was shameless in making friends with Jim Baker and Jim Johnson, both. And to thank Jim Baker for all he was doing, now this was the very early in the second administration actually, because by then Jim Baker was then the Secretary of the Treasury. And I happened to know, because we had done so much together before, that Jim Baker was, and probably still is, a tobacco-chewer. And he had a favorite brand called Red Man Chew, which is marketed and sold. I mean, its headquarters are in, I think, Owensboro. They're in Kentucky anyway. They're not Louisville, but someplace around here. So I called up the Red Man people and told them I was going to go take a thank you gift to Jim Baker, and what did they have they could give me? And so they gave me, to take to Jim, a brass spittoon with their little logo on it, and a belt buckle that said Red Man Chew, and a hunting knife that said Red Man Chew. So I flew down. Remember, this is before 9/11, okay?
Yes.
I just put those other things down in the spittoon because I had to carry it on the plane. You couldn't, you know. So I did. What's amazing is nobody questioned that either. I mean, But I got out and took a taxi right to the Treasury Department and went through. They did have a screening system, an X-ray. You put everything through the X-ray and then you walk through and you whatever. And they went through and I went through and picked up a thing and walked in. Gave Jim Baker, he was thrilled to death with his spittoon, his belt buckle, and his pretty big hunting knife. And it wasn't until a whole lot later that I thought, how did that happen? What, what could have happened? It's a great story, but in retrospect, I might have been a little bit more savvy about security issues, but nobody questioned it.
It will never happen again.
That is true. Thank God.
Well, there was another really interesting occasion when you got in a little bit of trouble with the National Football League.
Oh, yeah. That's true.
And it was one of those occasions where your forthright personality paid off. Tell us about that.
Well, I learned from that school desegregation thing when we called up and said we're coming, that even when something looks impossible, go for it. And this was an instance in September of 1984. We announced the places and the dates. We've been working together with Jim and Jim, forever. The dates, places, times, everything about the presidential debates. First one, as you'll recall, was here in Louisville. The second one we announced the whole thing together as a package. Second one was to be in Kansas City on whatever the night was, the 21st, I think, of October. And we had a press conference, we did all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Press conference over, I went back to my office and sat down. The phone rang, and it was the Vice President for News of ABC. And he said, "Lady, you've just cost us mega $1 million." I said, what's wrong? And he explained that they had the contract for the football game that night, and they couldn't break the contract unless without paying all that money. And he said, of course we've got to carry the debate. We'd be, laughed out of journalism if we didn't. So I said, well, hang on a minute, hang on. So, I called our staff, senior staff in and laid it for them, and we all agreed that we had to do something about this, not just let it go and let ABC pay all that money. So I called Pete Rozelle, who was whatever the title is, he's the head of he's whatever, commissioner of the National Football League, okay. Explained nicest man in the world, by the way. But I explained our problem, and of course he didn't want the NFL, to look at it, clearly, he didn't want the NFL to come off looking like none of us we all had something to lose in sticking with this original plan. So he said, look, I'll tell you what. We talked about times. He said, you start your debate 45 minutes earlier, we'll start our football game 45 minutes later. I'll give you the time to read. That's a great deal. So I called ABC back. I'll never forget this one. Vice President of ABC News heard all this, paused and said, "Lady, you've just climbed the glass mountain in carpet slippers." Don't you love it? Oh, now I have to tell you that the second call then was from Sports Illustrated. Said, "We've just heard the most ridiculous thing. The NFL doesn't ever change this time." I said, "Well, anyway, so it worked. It worked. They played their football game late. We started ours early."
We know that your interaction with the Presbyterian Church has been important on so many levels, but perhaps no occasion was more significant than when you were in Biloxi in 1987. With a whole group of people from Louisville, bankers and elected officials and so forth. And it was all very exciting. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And in it, I would love for you to tell us the jet story. Oh,
yeah. Okay. That's the beginning of it. I had just retired as president of the League of Women Voters of the United States and was in a management training program with Knight Ridder to become a publisher of one of their papers. And they sent me to Charlotte for 2 years because they said, stay out of the newsroom, you know that part. Go learn advertising and circulation and distribution and production and blah, blah, blah. So I was in Charlotte. I'd been there a very short period of time when the General Assembly scheduled its meeting in Biloxi. Now, before that, John Mulder, who's the one who ought to get the prize, along with, of course, David Jones Sr., who was so good about all this and did so much for us. But John's the one who brought us together, and there was a planning team, and that's too long to spend too much time on now, but I really want to publicly acknowledge the fact that this is a good politician, this guy. And so I was to be one of the spokespersons. John, Jerry Abramson, Virgil Cruz, who was a seminary professor here, and I were to be the presenters of Louisville's case. Anyway, so I had to be there, and I'd already gotten okay from the publisher, but Knight Ridder was moving its board meetings around, and that was the day that Knight Ridder had its board meeting in Charlotte. So I was in the observer boardroom sitting in the back. You know how you do that, they all gather around the table and then everybody else sits around the back. I was at the back, and I really didn't know these people very well at all. They were in the middle of the meeting, though, when the secretary of the publisher came into the room and looked around and said, "Ms. Ridings, I just got a call from the airport and your jet is on approach." Now, all of you business people, think about this. There's this relatively young woman sitting in this board meeting who's been told that her jet is on approach. Of course, David Jones was the secret to that. He sent the Humanijet to ferry us around, and that's the only way I could get there and back. And so the Humanijet was on approach. Then we went to Biloxi and made our presentation. Long story short, there's tons of stories that could be told about that, and John knows all of them, so he can fill that in. But I think what you want me to tell is about when we learned how that had happened.
Yes.
We made our presentation. My part was to say that, yes, you can get into and out of Louisville with air service, because I'd been traveling for the League and for other organizations as well all over the world by then. And they took the ballots, they counted the ballots, and it was silence, or people were milling around while they were counting the ballots, and they came back in. By that time, Virgil, Jerry, and I don't know where John was. I'm sorry, John, I don't remember. But the three of us others who were presenting with you were sitting in this, it's kind of the bleachers, close-in bleachers in Biloxi. And Virgil was on one side, Jerry was on the other. Now, let me first just quickly say, if anybody is bothered by slightly scatological language, just stick your hair here, because this is going to be a Jerry Abrams story, so you know. Those of you in Louisville know. So they came back. We were all just so nervous. And they announced the vote, and we had won by, I mean, a handful, 8 or 10 or 12 or something. I mean, it was something out of, it's 560-something to 550-something, or something like that. They announced that vote. Jerry Abrams, I wish he'd been able to be here tonight, because I would have loved to have told this with him in the room. He shot out of the chair and he said, "Holy shit!" Well, again, I'll drop it there, except to tell you that Jerry, who, by the way, is of the Jewish faith, we don't give at the seminary. The seminary was so instrumental in that whole event. I mean, it was just central. And we don't give honorary degrees. So we make Jerry an honorary Presbyterian. He knows that.
Good idea. We don't have a lot of time left, but I know there's a really important story you could tell us about the time you and Don met Nelson Mandela.
Oh, yeah, I wrote about that for the Courier Journal.
You did?
Yes.
You and your son, Chip, Don, have both written for the Courier Journal on
That's
occasion.
That's correct. I think he wrote for you, didn't he?
The very first story that appeared on the forum page after I became editor was written by Chip.
Well, it's not Chip anymore.
I know, by Don.
Yeah.
Anyway, tell us about that occasion.
Okay, I served as a trustee of the Ford Foundation for a number of years until I became president of the Council on Foundations, and then I ended all my formal affiliations with foundations, with grant-making foundations. But during my Ford years, Don and I together, and sometimes me by myself, traveled to visit various programs throughout the world that Ford was funding. And a number of them, of course, were in South Africa. We were very interested in South Africa. And I had met Nelson Mandela before, but then when we went back the second time, Don and I were together, and I said, I want you to meet this man. He's magic. He's just this magic. You will feel that. Don was in a wheelchair and had some. Don Ridings was in a wheelchair and had suffered some health problems, and was very open about that. But he didn't make it part of his central life. But when we went to meet with Nelson Mandela, whom Don admired from knowing his history, and I introduced them, and Mandela immediately seized on the fact that this is a man who has a disability, but he came in a wheelchair from the United States to go see this project that we particularly had funded through the Ford Foundation. And they carried on a conversation. I just stepped back and listened. And Don later told me after we had left that, he said, that man has just inspired me to speak out on disability rights. And he had not done that before. And so I thought, that was Nelson Mandela to me.
Yes, it was. I think it's fitting to draw this to an end after that lovely story, by talking about educational opportunity. It's something that you've long advocated. When we met to prepare for this occasion, we both talked about how difficult it is today for young people to afford to go to college and then to go to graduate school and maybe to go to get a PhD beyond that. You strongly believe in the Covenant for the Future strategic plan here at the seminary. I'd love for you to give us some words about that to inspire us.
Yeah. I've mentioned as we conversed through this evening about several times when I wasn't proud of myself and I wish I had done it differently. One I didn't mention was back when I was a senior in high school and I was editor of the high school paper, and we had a newly integrated high school, and my homeroom was the staff of the high school paper. They closed the formerly all-black high school and spread them to the other high schools. And so in my homeroom was one black man, young man, who would have been the editor of the Garnet High School newspaper had he been there. I missed a wonderful opportunity. I should have, I know now, looking back, it still sticks with me. It's one of those things that I didn't do what would have been the most wonderful thing, which was to take advantage of the fact that he was there and that what he could help us do I missed that opportunity. Later on, I've had other times when I thought, why didn't I do that? One of them was, frankly, Lant Davis, you're around here somewhere, who's a trustee of this institution, and more than 10 years ago, when he was on the staff of the seminary, he wrote a paper that I should have paid more attention to, Lant, because frankly, it had the genesis of the Covenant for the Future plan in it, where students who are selected, the high performers who are going to bring the most promise for the future for the church, are admitted into the seminary family at no cost. And in a few years, at no cost for their living expenses either. We as a church have got to listen to the people who want to do, who have a mission and can't afford it. That's just unconscionable for us to let that happen. I truly believe the future of our church rests in our ability to make an excellent, top-notch seminary education possible. Not just for those in the pulpit, for the church leaders abroad, all across all their callings. And we've got to do that. Louisville Seminary can lead the way, on that. I serve on the board of the Association of Theological Schools, which is the umbrella organization for divinity schools, theological seminaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they are so eager to see how we pull this off. And pull it off, we will. Again, I not only believe it because I see the passion in this board who's going to do it, I see the passion in the president, in the faculty, in the student body even though many of them will have graduated by then, after paying the way, but they come in with the student debt. We cannot let that situation continue. An educated clergy for an educated church, for an educated world, and that's exactly what it is. That's the price, and we can make that happen, and I hope we all together will do just that. I'm confident we will.
Thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure, and thank you all for being here tonight.